All right, let's dive into the world of biblical scholarship for a second. So, you know those pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus? Yeah, they've been a bit of a hot topic among scholars, especially when it comes to who actually wrote them. The majority of biblical scholars argue that they're forged by some guy pretending to be Paul long after he was killed. But here's where it gets interesting. Enter undesigned coincidences. Yep, I guess I'm not quite done talking about them after all. Okay, so for you newbies, imagine that you're reading two different history books, right? And suddenly you notice these little details that fit together perfectly, almost like puzzle pieces. But here's the deal. These details you notice aren't really obvious, and they're clearly not intentional. They just naturally mesh. That's what we call an undesigned coincidence. We expect this kind of thing to crop up in real history, but not in made-up stories. These coincidences can help us confirm historical stuff in the Bible, as we've talked about in previous videos. Just go check out the playlist. But they can also help us figure out who wrote certain letters. In the pastoral letters, we spot some of these cool coincidences that really back up the idea that Paul actually did write them, and they're not just some later fakes. Take, for instance, 2 Timothy 3:14 through 15, where it talks about Timothy continuing in the scriptures he's learned since childhood. It's echoed in 2 Timothy 1:5, mentioning Timothy's grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice, both instrumental in his upbringing. Now, flip back to Acts 16:1, and you find Timothy, son of a Jewish mother and a Greek father, a detail that isn't glossed over in the epistles. Later we see Timothy getting circumcised by Paul, showing that apparently his dad drew the line at circumcision. What's intriguing is how Acts subtly hints that Timothy's father wasn't a believer, while the epistles highlight the faith of his mother Eunice. This kind of incidental overlap between Acts and the epistles adds weight to the authenticity of the letters. And here's the interesting part. It's pretty unlikely that a forger would bother crafting such intricate details. I mean, why fabricate Timothy's grandmother and single out his upbringing by women? It's not exactly the plot twist that would make for a compelling forgery. In a culture where male lineage mattered, it's noteworthy that Timothy's faith is traced through his mother's side. It's a subtle touch that rings true to real life. Let's unravel another intriguing coincidence found in 2 Timothy 4:20. Paul sharing about his buddies, mentioning how Erastus stayed back in Corinth, while Trophimus was left sick in Miletus. Then he's like, hey Timothy, make sure to swing by before winter hits. Now what's fascinating is the link between Timothy and Erastus. Acts 19:22 spills the beans that they were tight buds, part of Paul's crew, and that they traveled together from Corinth. So it totally clicks for Paul to name drop Erastus in a letter to Timothy, especially if Corinth was his home stomping grounds. But hold up, because it gets even cooler. In Romans 16:23, there's Erastus again, this time labeled as the city treasurer. And guess where Paul's writing from? Yep, you guessed it, it's Corinth. How do we know that? Well, we just rewind to 1 Corinthians 16:1 through 4. There, Paul's talking about collecting donations for Jerusalem and hints that he'll swing by Corinth to pick it up. Fast forward to Romans 15:28, and he's like, yep, I got the collection. So that's why in 2 Timothy 4:20, Paul mentions Erastus hanging around in Corinth, and then in Romans 16:23, he's referred to as the city treasurer. It all fits together like pieces of a puzzle. And get this, on top of that, archaeological digs in Corinth even found an inscription mentioning Erastus as a city official. While we can't be 100% certain that it's the same Erastus, it's super intriguing to say the least. Now, let's zoom in on 2 Timothy 2:22, where Paul's dropping some wisdom on Timothy, telling him to steer clear of those typical youthful temptations and chase after righteousness, faith, love, and peace. This isn't the first time Paul's had to remind Timothy about his age. Check out 1 Timothy 4:12, where Timothy's told not to let anyone look down on him just because he's young. So it totally makes sense for Paul to circle back to this in his second letter, warning Timothy to dodge these youthful traps. But here's the twist. Remember 1 Corinthians 16:10? Paul's telling the Corinthians not to look down on Timothy and to help him out on his journey. At first glance, it seems kind of random, right? But when you put it together with what we learn in 2 Timothy, it totally clicks. Paul was actually addressing concerns about Timothy's youthfulness. All right, let's break down another example found in 2 Timothy 3:10 through 11. Paul's laying it out, talking about how Timothy's been following his teachings and even endured some of the same hardships, like those persecutions in Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra. But hold up, this isn't just some random name dropping of some cities. You see, in Acts 13 and 14, we get the lowdown on Paul's adventures in those very cities. He faced all sorts of trials, from being kicked out by the Jews to straight up getting stoned. And guess what? The order of events matches up perfectly with what Paul mentions in his letter to Timothy. But here's where it gets even more interesting. In 2 Timothy, Paul only mentions Lystra, leaving out Derbe. And you know what? In Acts 14:21, Luke doesn't mention any trouble in Derbe either. Plus, when you consider Timothy's backstory in Acts 16, where he's introduced as a disciple from Lystra, it all starts to make sense. Timothy was likely there during Paul's earlier journey, witnessing these events firsthand, or at least being well aware of them. But notice how subtle and indirect this all is. It feels totally natural and unplanned. All right, let's wrap things up with one more sneaky coincidence, this time involving Alexander the coppersmith. So Paul's griping about this guy in 2 Timothy 4:14-15, saying he's caused him a ton of trouble. But here's where it gets interesting. Now, if somebody was making up these letters, they'd probably go for the obvious choice, Demetrius the silversmith from Acts 19, who is causing a ruckus in Ephesus, where Timothy's stationed according to the pastoral letters. But nah, the letter throws us a curveball by mentioning Alexander instead. But get this, in 1 Timothy 1:18-20, there's just a passing mention of Alexander, not even hinting that he's a metalworker. Check this out. In Acts 19, there's this riot in Ephesus with Demetrius and his crew, all of similar trades. Now in 2 Timothy, Alexander pops up, described as a worker in a similar trade to Demetrius. It's like these connections are just too spot on to ignore, adding a whole nother layer of authenticity to the story. Putting it all together feels like cracking a perfect mystery puzzle. The author of Timothy isn't copying Acts to craft a more believable letter. It's like both authors intimately know Timothy and Paul's story independently. And those scholars suggesting some random guy from the 2nd century forged these letters are just totally off base in my opinion. All right, folks, so that really wraps it up for this series, I promise, at least for now. But don't worry, I've got plenty of more fascinating tidbits to share that back up the biblical narrative. So be sure to hit that subscribe button, tap the bell, and stay tuned for more. Thanks for watching.